On to our other big focus now. At the beginning of 2022, Russia-China ties were touted by Beijing as a no-limits partnership. Both countries, not on great terms with the West, were joining hands across the Pacific. A partnership that likely concerned Washington. But as the year has gone by, much has changed. Russia is actively engaged in a war in Ukraine. 7 months on, it has not made substantial gains. And as some Western experts say, Moscow is nowhere close to winning the war. A month ago, Chinese and Russian presidents held their first in-person talk since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The meeting took place on the sidelines of the SCO summit in Uzbekistan. The statements released after the meeting raised questions as to whether a red line might soon appear in the no-limits friendship between the two countries. Xi Jinping expressed his concerns and asked questions of his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. Beijing has still not publicly condemned or openly supported Russia in its aggression against Ukraine. Now, in the next 2 weeks, when the Chinese Communist Party meets for its Congress, there might appear a shift in Beijing's policy away from Moscow, even if slightly so. Now, former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has said Xi Jinping gave a blank check to Putin. He must have thought the Russian invasion would be successful. But now the Chinese president might need to recalibrate his stance. Kissinger says a slow easing of US-China tensions can begin as early as next month at the G20 summit, when Xi Jinping will be under the same roof as President Joe Biden. Sparks flared up between the two countries earlier this year after US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. It was seen as a grave provocation by Beijing. China, in retaliation, cut off several diplomatic and security engagements with the United States. Kissinger says Xi Jinping would rather want to avoid a united Western opposition against China, the way it has happened to Russia. However, he adds that China would continue building up its military, but will most likely not get into a direct confrontation over Taiwan until much later in Xi's presidency. For more on this story, we're now joined by Andrew KP Leung from Hong Kong. He is an international and independent strategist. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Now, it's very interesting what former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has said today. He says the Chinese president for far too long decided to give Putin a blank check in this ongoing Ukraine war, probably because he believed that Russia was going to end up on the winning side and the invasion would be a successful one. But now Xi Jinping might need to recalibrate his stance, given that he's already expressed some concerns in the recent past. As the Chinese Communist Party gets set to meet for its Congress on the 16th of October, are we likely to see a shift in Beijing's policy with a tilt away from Moscow, even if a marginal one? All right, I believe we can now go across to Andrew KP Leung from Hong Kong. Andrew, I hope you can hear me this time round. The question I'm asking is, former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has said the Chinese president for far too long gave Putin a blank check, probably because he believed the Russian invasion would be a successful one. But now he might need to recalibrate his stance as the Chinese Communist Party meets for its Congress on the 16th of this month. Are we likely to see a shift in Beijing's policy with a tilt away from Moscow?
I think the reference to a blank check is over the tops. In fact, the relationship is a more complex one. First of all, of course, the two countries are put together by the United States regarding both countries as their arch enemies. So there is a coincidence of these pressures from the United States, and that the two countries need to form a closer partnership. Secondly, the Russian economy is a one-trick economy, almost relying on the export of energy and agricultural products like fertilizer, and for which China is the biggest customer. So there's a great complementarity between the two sides. But as far as the war on Ukraine is concerned, on the one hand, while China doesn't want to the whole world order is now being led by the United States, trying to impose its will on the rest of the world. Of course, the two countries would like to form some sort of a partnership to withstand this kind of pressure. But on the other hand, the war in Ukraine does present problems for China because it tramples on other countries' sovereignty, and then the maintenance of countries' sovereignty is the bottom line for China's geopolitical stance, both in terms of Taiwan and in terms of other relationship. But also, as the whole world is changing quite rapidly, so China needs to carefully manage its stance. But then the basic tenets of the partnership still remain very strong, as I said, because of the push by the United States against two countries, because of the complementarity of the two countries, because the two countries are allying and rallying the developing world to withstand this kind of pressure from the United States unilateralism.
All right. Interesting. You're saying the relationship fundamentally will remain strong. There is complementarity between the two sides, but Beijing might have some concerns about the Ukraine war, given that this is a question of another country's sovereignty. Let's now talk about the the US-China relationship, a rather thorny one. Now, Kissinger has also said that a slow easing of ties between US and China could in fact begin as early as next month at the G20 summit, when the Chinese president is going to share the stage with US President Joe Biden. Is that a possibility, given how high tensions have been running, especially since US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan?
Well, I think it's that Taiwan, as far as Taiwan is concerned, of course, this is a highly sensitive issue for China. President Xi has made it quite plain for a long time that the unification of China, including, of course, Taiwan, cannot be allowed to drag on for decades. And then, of course, it is part of the China dream, the unification, by the year 2049 at the latest, which is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. But on the other hand, China issued a second or third white paper recently, just after Nancy Pelosi's visit, still putting a great deal of setting great store on peaceful unification. But what does it mean if Taiwan is veering further and further away from mainland China, and then the United States is trying to hollow out the so-called One China policy by creating more diplomatic space for Taiwan to play as if it was a separate country, and by arming Taiwan to the teeth. I think the answer lies in a bit of both, because on the one hand, China is setting a deadline of 2049, and of course that after the Nancy Pelosi visit, Beijing showed that its full capability to surround and blockade Taiwan. But on the other hand, trying to create more space for dialogue between Beijing and Taiwan, including Taiwanese people. But at the end of the day, most of the Taiwanese people, of course, they do not support unification immediately, but neither do they want a war. And all they want is to maintain the status quo. But as I said, the status quo cannot be last forever. So I think that the Taiwanese are likely to view the situation with a great deal of realism, in the sense that at the end of the day, Beijing is not going to impose communism on Taiwan as it has not imposed communism on Hong Kong, for example. So I think that the bottom line is that at the end of the day, most of the Taiwanese people will see the reality and would come to the negotiating table. But that's the hope. But because there's a lot of risks on both sides between the United States and China with this mutual confrontation over the Taiwan Strait.
Right. Now, of course, that is the Chinese perspective, but there is also the question of Taiwan's sovereignty, the way it sees it and the way the West sees it. It will be interesting to see if on the question of Taiwan, there can in fact be a thaw in US-China ties, especially when the presidents of the two countries meet at the G20 summit next month. But for now, all eyes will be on the CPC Congress that gets underway in China on the 16th of this month. Andrew, thank you very much for speaking to WION and sharing your perspective with us on that big and developing story.